we are going to dive right into Score the Shore. I am Dr. Joe Latimore. I am the director of the MiCorps program. MiCorps, of course, includes all of our volunteer lake and stream monitoring programs for the state of Michigan. Today, we're talking about our Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program and offering training on the various parameters that you can choose from. So this morning we had a great mix of new folks and experienced volunteers joining in. And as Eric mentioned, we welcome your questions. We can make this interactive, even though we're not in person, by using the chat at the bottom of the screen, or you can type in your questions as we go along. Yeah, I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at MSU, where I focus on lake ecology with a particular focus on invasive species, native aquatic plants, and of course, volunteer monitoring of our lakes and streams. As many of you realize, if you love a lake or live on a lake or recreate on a lake, you may know already kind of intrinsically the value of healthy shoreline. They're really important for a lot of reasons. One of the major reasons is the habitat value that they provide. Fish, of course, birds, amphibians, and other animals rely on natural shorelines for hunting, for hiding from predators, reproduction, shelter, overwintering. All of that are important aspects of healthy shorelines on Michigan lakes. They also help maintain water quality by providing a buffer against pollution. They limit erosion, keeping soil in place, and they slow runoff of rain that may include pollutants into the water and protecting that shoreline habitat. So there's a lot of value to healthy shorelines. On the other side, unhealthy shorelines can cause a lot of problems. And our shorelines are actually fairly threatened in Michigan. What we know from research surveying lakes all over the state is that development on our shorelines and changing shorelines from natural to overly developed is the biggest threat to the health of our inland lakes. And so having information about the status of our shorelines is incredibly important. Development is often done not really thinking about the lake and being lake friendly. It's not done with the lake in mind. It often eliminates important components of the healthy shoreline. Lawn going right up to the shoreline, rock put in excessively, seawalls, they can all remove optimal habitat locations. And then excess foot traffic, docks, and the desire for an unobstructed view of the lake sometimes lead to the removal of vegetation whose roots can stop erosion and shelter the shoreline. To just illustrate how shorelines have changed in Michigan over the years, I'm just going to show an example of a lake in Southwest Michigan. It's got an aerial photo I'm showing you here from 1938. And you can see how the shoreline of this bay and the lake itself are very, very natural. Even though there's obviously agricultural development and roads in the vicinity of the lakeshore itself is very natural. Now let's fast forward to 2014, and we can see the very same lake is dramatically changed. Housing development all along the shoreline here. We have canals that have been dredged out to provide additional access to the water. And so wetlands and natural shorelines have been dramatically altered in those decades between those two images. And I can show you another one, same time frame, 1938. We have our natural shoreline area, some wetlands along the lakeshore. And fast forward to 2014, where that entire landscape has been developed. And again, canals put in to provide additional waterfront access, and we're seeing a lot of change. And just to bring it home, here's the third example. Again, 1938 ahead to 2014. And you can see how tidy and straight the lakeshore is now. And also you can see how close together the homes are along the shoreline here. There's not a lot of natural shoreline left. As you can imagine, if you were out in your kayak kind of paddling along the shoreline, you'd see a lot of homes, a lot of docks, and a lot of seawalls. So, in response to our growing understanding and public understanding of the value of natural shorelines, several years ago, we turned to our volunteers and said, if you could have anything else added to the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program, anything new that you could collect data about your lake, what would it be? And nearly unanimously, the response was, we want to know how to measure the health of our shoreline. Um, and so, in response to those volunteers' requests, we developed the new Score the Shore program. Anymore, it's not that new. I think we have at least 10 years of data or years of data collection in Score the Shore. We work directly with volunteers. This is actually an image of the development process when I was out on a lake with some volunteers who offered to help us test an early draft of this protocol to make sure that it made sense, that it was efficient, and collected data that would be useful. And it's a standardized approach that allows you to assess the health of the lake shoreline, to identify high quality areas to protect, and then also discover opportunities for improvement and restoration on your lake. The information is useful locally, of course. Lake associations and lakefront communities can use this information to support education, educational efforts around your lake, and to inform lake management planning. Again, are there areas we should protect that already, still have a nice natural shoreline? Or are there areas where we can work with property owners to improve or restore to a more natural state? And then regionally and statewide, the information is very useful for helping, for example, the state of Michigan assess the health of Michigan's lake shores. It's useful for research, for understanding how our shorelines are changing across the state and the region, and also for agency reporting on the overall health of our lake shores. In addition to Score the Shore, which we'll dive into in a few minutes, there are some really excellent resources available. If you're interested in learning more about natural shorelines, how to promote natural shoreline development on your own property or within your community, we love to refer people to these two Michigan-focused resources. First, the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership at myshoreline.partnership.org offers a wealth of information about natural shorelines, including lists of plants that grow really well around Michigan lake shores, educational brochures and pamphlets that you can print out and share with your neighbors. And it even sponsors a training program for landscapers and professionals. If you don't want to necessarily take on a big landscaping project or a shoreline restoration project on your own, there is a certified natural shoreline professional program run by the Shoreline Partnership that trains these landscapers in how to do natural shoreline restorations. And there's a listing of all those certified professionals on the partnership website. The other tool that kind of goes hand in hand with Score the Shore is the Michigan Shoreland Stewards Program. If you visit mishorelandstewards.org, you'll be presented with a questionnaire, a survey that you can take about your own property. So this isn't asking questions about your entire lake or part of the lake. It's asking about your individual property. It gives you a chance to do like a self-quiz to see how you're doing. And along every question, it offers suggestions on things that you could do on your lake to be a little more lake friendly. So Shoreline Partnership, Shoreland Stewards are both really great websites to explore. Other shoreline resources that we like to send people to include these Shoreline Living magazines. There's 2 editions, the covers of which you can see on your slide here, and these are developed by the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, of which Michigan is a partner. And these publications provide a number of stories that are beautifully illustrated with professional photos of different types of natural shorelines. Some are still quite manicured and look, very more formal, but still are in a lake-friendly design. And others are more wild. So you can flip through these stories and see examples of different types of natural shorelines and hear from the property owners themselves about the process of maintaining or restoring their shorelines and the joy and benefits that they get from having natural shoreline on their property. If you visit midwestglaciallakes.org, under resources, you will find these magazines. You can order hard copies or you can download the stories. You can download the photographs. All of them are available free of charge. And so you can use them and share them with your community. All right, let's dive right in now into Score the Shore. So basically, what you're going to do is you're going to answer a set of questions, basically fill out a report card about every 1,000-foot section of shoreline on your lake. So a small team will troll around the edge of the lake in a boat and assess the health of the shoreline using a scoring form that we've developed. And as you can see in this map, the shoreline is broken into 1,000-foot sections, which are assessed individually. They don't have to be precisely 1,000 foot, and you don't have to go into every little corner of the lake to measure that. Just generally 1,000-foot sections. The results. You're going to get a lot of information about your shoreline. It's a really valuable educational tool where you don't just have to say, oh, look over there, that lake shore is healthy. Oh, that one's not. You'll have some data, you'll have numbers that you can use where you can say, oh, the north side of the lake is scoring really high. It's getting like a 95% on Score the Shore, but the south side may be getting only a 45%. That's going to show you, numbers and data that you can talk about to educate your community and yourself. The results aren't regulatory. This isn't something that, is sent to the state of Michigan so they can come down and write tickets for people that have seawalls. It's nothing like that. That doesn't happen. So this is for research, for understanding, and for education. All right. So if you're getting ready to do this, we're going to walk you through the process of preparation. There is a set of paperwork that we've developed for you. We have a print procedure for Score the Shore. So everything I cover today is in writing with examples. Many of the photos I'm going to show you today are also in the procedures. We also have the data forms for you. There's a cover sheet that goes on top of your survey that answers some general questions about your lake. And then there are section data forms. And as I mentioned, you're going to divide your lake into 1,000-foot sections, and you'll fill out one data form for each 1,000-foot section. So you may need to print or copy out many of these depending on how big your lake is. And all of these are available electronically, MiCorps.net, at our lake monitoring site under CLMP documents. Equipment that you will need to provide, of course, a boat and all your associated safety equipment, the copies of the data forms that you'll need, have a copy of the procedure with you in case you have questions when you're out on the water, pencils or waterproof pens for writing, clipboards for holding your paperwork, a GPS unit or having GPS capability on your phone to actually record the coordinates of the beginning and end of each section is really useful. You don't have to have it. You can just mark it on a map, paper map, it works just fine. But having those coordinates will be really helpful if you ever need to go back and figure out where a certain area was, or if you want to repeat this survey in the future. A camera is also optional, but very helpful. Again, this could also be on your phone along with the GPS to take pictures of things you observe. Binoculars to see the shore more clearly can be useful. And tally counters, those little clickers where you can click as you're counting things, those are really helpful too. Again, optional. You're going to be counting things like houses and docks and pieces of wood in the water. So these clickers are really helpful, but you don't have to have them. All right, when do you do it? How much work is this going to be? Those are common questions about all of our protocols. So we recommend doing this no earlier than mid-June. You're going to be looking at vegetation. So you need the vegetation both in the water and on shore to be fully leafed out so you can really see the extent of the vegetation. If you're in the UP or northern lower, you can begin a little later in the summer. Again, be the judge of when you know that the vegetation is fully leafed out. Of course, the length of time that it's going to take depends on the size of your lake. A small lake might be able to get this done in a couple of hours. Bigger lakes, it may take several days of effort. That doesn't all have to happen at once. You can work on it throughout the summer to get it done. Your shoreline should not change dramatically from, say, July to August. So if you need a little extra time, need to bite off chunks to get it all done, that's totally fine. In our experience working with volunteers, when you're first getting started, each data sheet, every 1,000-foot section, may take you a half an hour or more to get through it, to feel like you've answered the questions accurately. But once you get good at it, 15 to no more than 30 minutes per 1,000-foot section. So that'll give you a sense of how long it might take on your lake. We also suggest repeating the survey every 3 to 5 years. It's unlikely that your shoreline is going to change a lot from one year to the next. Of course, you're welcome to do it every year, but every 3 to 5 years is when you're most likely to see the impact of either increased development and more shoreline disturbance, or on the other hand, if people are working to restore to a more natural state, again, you may need a few years to see that change and see the improvement in your scores. Before you even go out in the boat, we highly recommend that you set up your shoreline sections ahead of time, so you know exactly where to navigate to in the boat and where your sections start and stop. I like to use Google Maps. It works really well online to create approximate 1,000-foot sections. It can measure distance. If you right click on a map in Google Maps, and then drag your mouse, you can collect measure distance and you can drag it out and create 1,000-foot lines. And that's how we did it in the example shown on your screen. There's other ways to do it too. You can do it on paper or other ways. But one thing that we do find, and I've seen this with volunteers I go out with, if you don't set up your shoreline sections ahead of time, your group will spend more time arguing about where to start and stop than actually doing the survey. So do this ahead of time so everyone's in agreement on where your start and stop is. And then number them sequentially. Start with number 1 and move your way around section 2, 3, 4, 5. Recording the coordinates or landmarks at the beginning or end of your sections is really helpful. And a quick request is to not use people's names for landmarks. We occasionally will get reports returned to us for Score of the Shore where every section is described by whose property it is. You know, this is John Smith's property, this is Mary Doe's property, and we have to go and redact all that private information before we use those reports or put them into our files. So it's better to say red house or purple flag or, you know, whatever is useful for you, windmill, and addresses. You can use addresses if you know them, that's fine, but just don't use people's names or personally identifying information. You can use whatever, as I mentioned before, any technology you want, but the important thing is to do this ahead of time. All right, you ready to go out on the water? Here we go. So the general process that we recommend as far as the sequence of events, this is what seemed to work well for the volunteers that we trained with, is that you should have at least 3 people on the boat. One person is just going to be driving because there's a lot of moving of the boat during this process. And then have 2 others who will discuss and decide on the answers to the questions. We've also determined that it makes sense to navigate the section in the boat back and forth 3 times. So go out, back, and out again. That's because on the data sheet, what you'll see is that it's divided into 3 sets of questions. The first and third set of questions you can answer pretty easily being 100 yards or more out from the water. You can be kind of out and take in the big picture of the shoreline. But the questions in the center section, section 2, you might need to get a little closer. Navigate your boat a little bit closer so you can really see what's going on the shoreline. The team should answer questions on every pass. Often the teams, everybody who isn't a driver will have a copy of the data sheet and kind of jot down their answers and then come to agreement before you move on a consensus answer to the questions. One person will record the final answers on a final version of the data form. There's some math involved. You don't have to do that on the boat. You can do the math back at home after you're done doing the survey. And I'll show you that math in a little bit. So here we are. This is the cover sheet. This is the sheet that will show only, you need 1 copy of it. It's just an overview summary of your survey. This is the top half of the sheet where you record details like lake name, county, township, your field ID number that we assigned to you. They'll list the names of all the volunteers and the dates of the survey, 1 or more days that you were actually on the water. There's also a few questions about lake level. What level was the lake at when you actually did the survey? Average or low or high? If you have a legal lake level, you can indicate that and what the gauge reading is. And then there's also room to comment on whether you feel the lake level impacted the survey results. Since we're answering question about the lakeshore, there may be cases where if the lake is really high or really low, the shoreline might not look like it usually does. So you can comment there. The bottom half is where you're going to put in some numbers when you're all done. Again, this is the cover sheet. You'll list how many 1,000-foot sections that you have, and if there was one that was, a little 20-foot, 5-foot section at the end, you can mention that too, or a 100-foot section. And then you will list some numbers. Under development density, you'll type in or write in the total number of all the buildings and docks around your lake, the total number of sections, divide the two so you can get an average number of structures per 1,000 feet. And then on this side, on the right-hand side, your overall shore score. So you'll add all of your scores together, divide by the total number of sections to get your shore score for your whole lake. It's just your average score for each section. Nice summary of information. We find those two things are very strongly related. The more buildings and docks you have, the lower your shore score probably will be for your lake. All right, here's the nitty gritty. This is the data sheet that you will fill out for every 1,000-foot section. You start out at the top, writing the section number, lake and county and date, and then fill in the GPS coordinate or landmark at the start of the section. All right, here's section 1 of the questions. Again, you can do that 100 yards from shore as a guideline. Count the number of homes and major buildings you can see from the water. That's how we determine that. If you can see them from the water, then you count them. You also count the number of docks and lifts that you see. Then you go a little bit closer in, and you're going to answer some questions about vegetation in the water. And we'll go through all of these one by one here in a minute. But one thing I want to point out is if you look at this very first one, it's asking about the percentage of emergent and floating vegetation. And the structure of this question is used in several questions throughout the survey. So you'd be looking at the vegetation, and then it asks you to put an X in one of these spots. Either there's no vegetation, less than 10% of that 1,000-foot section has vegetation, 10 to 25% of the 1,000 feet, 25 to 75% of the 1,000 feet, or more than 75%. As you're going to understand as we go through this is a subjective survey. We're not actually asking you to actually measure anything. The only accurate numbers you're going to be collecting are like number of houses or number of docks. Everything else is your team's best estimate of the situation. Another thing that you'll notice when you look at the question is there's a number in parentheses after the different answers that you might choose. That number in parentheses is the score. That's how many points you get for that. So in this case, if you have no vegetation, that's 0 points. But if more than 75% of the section has emergent or floating vegetation, that's a good thing. You get 4 points. The bottom half of the data sheet is, again, you can go a little further out from shore, and you're going to answer some questions about the riparian area. So that's the upland area, the dry land near the lakeshore. And finally, shoreline erosion control practices. This is things like seawalls or rock that have been put in to prevent erosion. And then you end by putting in a landmark or GPS coordinate at the end of the section. I mentioned math. On the back of the sheet, there is a little numerical conversion we ask you to do. And the reason that we do that is that it scales your score to a 0 to 100 range. That will help people understand. If you can imagine, if the highest score you could get was a 57, it would be hard for people to immediately know, well, is a 40? Is that good or bad? But when we do it on a 0 to 100 scale, it's pretty intuitive for us that if somebody, if a lake scored 90, that's good. 30, not so great. So this is just converting everything to a 0 to 100 scale. You can do that back at home. All right, let's go through some of the questions on the data sheet. So counting buildings, pretty straightforward. Again, buildings you can see from the boat. That means if there's a shed or a detached garage, that's separate from the house. If you can see them both, that's 2 buildings. Docks, counting docks is usually pretty straightforward, but sometimes we see some pretty complicated docks that have, they're a T shape or they have a bunch of parking spots, 3 lifts, that kind of thing. And so You may decide to count what is really one big structure as more than one dock, and you may choose how many points you want to give, how many docks a certain complex dock or almost marina counts for. One rule of thumb would be to count how many boat parking places there are. Now let's go into a little bit closer. We've done our first pass, counting docks, counting houses and major buildings. Now let's get in a little closer and look at that vegetation. So here's the question we use as the first example, emergent of floating vegetation. In this picture, you can see both. When we talk about emergent vegetation, we're talking about things like these bulrushes, reeds, cattails, other plants that have their feet in the water but grow up emerging out of the water. Floating vegetation, of course, is things like lily pads. So you can add those together and you just answer how much of your 1,000-foot section has emergent or floating vegetation. None, less than 10%, 10 to 25%, 25 to 75%, or more than 75%. Algae and water that's plants that stick up out of the water like these lily pads, these also count as emergent and floating vegetation. Just another example. Sometimes we get questions about floating mats of algae. Does this count as emergent or floating vegetation? Our answer is yes. Algae are vegetation and they are floating, so you would count that as well. The next question asked about, it's basically the same question, but it's asking about submerged vegetation. This is water that plants that may come close to the surface, like this water milfoil. You may find that small flowers or other reproductive structures might poke out of the surface of the water, but the rest is underwater. This is submerged vegetation. So is this. Some submerged vegetation may be far below the surface, growing low against the lake bottom. You would count that as well. Now, one exceptional case that may happen on your lake is that you might not be able to know. You might not see. The water might be too cloudy or the light isn't good. You just don't know. Maybe the water becomes deep quite quickly and you may be unable to see. If that's the case, if you don't feel comfortable estimating the amount of submerged vegetation, you can just check unable to see for this question. The next question asks you if aquatic plant management is evident or known. And the choices here are no, nobody's managing the plants here. Or minor management is happening, maybe just around the docks or little swim areas. Or major plant management. Here we see a little bubbler that's being used to kind of keep some of that algae away. A single bubbler like this would be considered minor plant management. But if someone has run an aquatic plant harvester through the entire lakeshore, that's major plant management. So, of course, is extensive spraying of herbicide along the shoreline. Weed roller use, that's what we're looking at here. These are pivoting rollers that roll around on the lake bottom and kind of crush the vegetation. If you can see all these circles, most of these property owners are using them and moving them around. There's only a few areas where the plants are not being managed. So this would be considered major plant management. All right, next question. We're looking at the amount of woody debris, downed trees, logs, stumps, large branches that are in the water. These provide really excellent habitat for fish and amphibians and even birds in some cases. And so we ask you to count or estimate how much of that occurs across your 1,000-foot section of shoreline. Now, partially or fully submerged wood counts. And if the lake is kind of low, you may find that some of the wood is exposed, but you know normally it would be in the water. You can count that as well. We suggest that you concentrate your counting on pieces that are 3 inches in diameter or larger, like, you know, maybe the size of your arm around. You don't need to count all the little twigs. Here's an example of a tree that's fallen in that not all of it is in the water, but it's certainly still partly in the water, so you would count that as a piece. Sometimes the wood is put in intentionally. This is a project in a park where trees were cut and laid into the lakeshore to prevent erosion and provide habitat. Of course, it counts regardless of whether it got in there naturally or not. Here's another example. Some wood you encounter have been placed in control. You can definitely count it. Here's a person that put in stumps and old trunks to protect their shoreline from erosion, and you would count those as well. All right. The next question asks you about erosion that you might see. So here's where you start seeing some negative points, some problems in the lake. Here again, the question is structured where have you seen no erosion, maybe just minor erosion, moderate, or severe? Again, this is subjective, but some guidelines for you. Small areas of erosion would be considered minor. Here we just have a few spots. Maybe they used to leave a boat sit there, and so the grass has died, and you can see some little bits of maybe a little bit of erosion, not much. When you do the survey, be sure to include erosion that is clearly the result of human activity. Maybe there's a construction happening or some earth moving that's happened and it's eroding into the lake, but also erosion that may be caused by forces of nature like wind or waves or ice. That can also cause erosion. So regardless of why a lakeshore is eroding, you should count it. So again, this is an example of fairly minor. Situations like this are commonly seen. There's erosion all along the stretch of lake shore. It's probably not severe. You don't see a big hillside about to slump into the lake, but probably would be considered moderate because it's happening along a long stretch of shoreline. It also appears that the property owner is trying to stop it by placing some rocks in place along the lake shore. I would likely consider this more moderate erosion, not minor. Here's another example where you've got, again, it's not dramatic erosion, not severe, but it seems like more than minor. You can definitely see where chunks of this lawn have fallen into the lake. This would probably also be considered moderate unless you can see a lot of soil in the water, but you can definitely see, there's some soil that's washing down over the seawall right here for sure. And remember, always, you're thinking about across the entire 1,000-foot section. So if you had something like this, even if you thought it was kind of severe, it was only in a very small part of the section you're scoring, you might still decide to say moderate because in the context of the entire 1,000 feet, it's not so bad. Here's an example of something, at least in this small section, is quite severe. The hill slope is actively eroding. There's a lot of slumping happening here. That's a severe situation. So especially if you saw that along the majority of a 1,000-foot section, you would check severe. This property seems to have no vegetation on the slope and has the potential for serious erosion. In order to answer this question, I would want to approach closer in my boat and take a closer look to see if there's evidence of active erosion. Is there actually soil from the upland making its way into the lake? A question that sometimes comes up when people get out and start doing this is, does a beach count as erosion? And we would say only if there are active signs of the sand being lost into the lake. In this case, there might not be. As you can see, they've built a boulder seawall between the beach that looks like they probably brought in sand artificially, which we'll get to in a minute. But if it's not being lost into the lake, then it's not eroding. Also, if your lake is naturally sandy, sand beaches may just be a natural feature and should not be considered erosion. All right, here we go about that maintained beach. The next question asks you about what percentage of the shoreline section is either maintained lawn, maintained or artificial beach, or impervious. And so again, now at this point, when we're looking at erosion, we're further out. We can look at the whole shoreline. And when we say maintained lawn, we're looking at that here. It's turf grass or other vegetation that is regularly mowed for use or appearance as a lawn. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are putting fertilizer or, weed and feed or whatever. It doesn't, that you wouldn't know that anyway necessarily. Just is it all mowed? Then that's maintained lawn. You can see there's also some artificial erosion control happening here, which we'll get to in a minute. In this example, we see a maintained lawn as well as a small impervious walkway. Impervious means that water cannot penetrate, so that's an important definition. For this assessment, remember you judge the percent section length that is lawn, artificial beach, and impervious all together. So if it's a variety of all three things, it would still be, if that's all there was, you would check the more than 75%. This is an interesting example because you have lawn right up to the water's edge and then an impervious parking lot right behind it. This is 2 out of those 3 things. We have maintained lawn and we have impervious surface. So this entire stretch would be counted in your assessment. Here's an example of an impervious surface patio that water can't really seep through very well. If it was just all wood chips, then that can be saturated by water. We wouldn't call that as impervious, but the patio, yes, impervious. Concrete patios also count as impervious surface. Here's maintained lawn and maintained beach. So this whole stretch would be considered maintained lawn and artificial beach. There's a little bit of natural vegetation here and there, but the majority of it is lawn and beach. Here's this picture again. It's definitely a maintained beach, and so you would consider it as such when you're doing your score. All right. Here's a good thing, unmowed vegetation belts. So there's a few questions about that. These strips of vegetation that are not mowed along the shoreline. We don't care what species are there. They might all be, ornamentals from the nursery. They might not all be native plants. For this particular scoring procedure, it doesn't matter what species they are. That's the same is true way at the beginning when I talked about the vegetation in the lake. Even if it's all invasive species, that's okay. You would still count it. In this protocol, we're not asking you to be able to identify plant species. So, all right, you're looking at the riparian zone, unmowed vegetation belt. We're looking at 2 different characteristics. First, what percentage of that 1,000-foot section has unmowed vegetation? That can be plants, shrubs, trees, any of it. And then the second characteristic is on average, how deep is that belt of unmowed vegetation? That is, how far does it stretch back from the water's edge? So we're looking at the length of it along the 1,000-foot section. We're also looking, so along here, we're also looking at the depth of it. How far does it reach back from the water's edge? So the length of it, you're again looking at what percentage of your 1,000-foot section has unmowed vegetation. And then the depth of it, you're going to determine the average depth across that section that you're scoring. Is there none, or does it tend to be less than 10 feet, which is the case here? Is it 10 to 40 foot deep, or is it more than 40 foot deep? Like you have a forest that is right along the shoreline. In this picture, there appears to be some rock that may have been placed by people to prevent erosion in addition to the roots, the deep roots of these plants, and that's okay. You still count it as an unmowed vegetation belt. You may also comment on this erosion control in another question we're going to get to in a minute. This one, another unmowed vegetation belt. It's not very deep, but it's there. In this case, you've got a lot of different things going on. You've got little gravel pathways, but all of this is unmowed. It looks like it's not mowed until you get back here closer to the house in this big tree. So it would be the depth, and all of it is an unmowed vegetation belt. And if it's dense enough vegetation that you can't even see through it, like this case, go ahead and presume it's deeper than 40 feet back. In this case, we've got a little bit of everything. We have unmowed vegetation. There's a little lawn back here, but even right here, you've got a little strip. There's really nowhere where at the lakeshore where you're scoring is there no unmowed vegetation except for right here where they access it. So, if this was just your whole 1,000-foot section, you'd say more than 75% was made up of an unmowed vegetation belt. Now, let's look at shoreline erosion control practices. This is the last section on your data sheet. Some of the common ones that we see are artificial, right? People put in structures, metal, steel, rock, etc., to stop shoreline erosion. The first kind that we're going to talk about is the first question, vertical artificial. So structures like seawalls and rock walls that are vertical or practically vertical. This is a very common steel seawall that is commonly seen around lakes in Michigan. Another example of a quite extensive one on a point. Concrete, stamped concrete seawalls can also be seen. All of these are types of vertical artificial seawall. Large boulders like this and vertical walls of rock are also considered vertical artificial structures. Note here, we actually have a boulder vertical wall in front of a seawall. So you've kind of got a doubled up seawall situation here. This one is also considered vertical. Even though there's some slope to the boulders in front of the seawall, it doesn't pass what we like to call the turtle test. If a turtle has no chance of making it up onto dry land from the lake, it's probably a vertical artificial erosion control. Another example of boulders. This one, there may be some spots where the turtle could get up, but then as I look more closely, I notice these kayaks here. That gives me a good sense of the scale in this picture. These rocks are still pretty large. I'd look carefully, but I'm guessing, I would count this as vertical for sure. This one is more of sloped artificial. That's the next question. Asks you how much sloped artificial there is along your shoreline. This includes concrete, which is either smooth or broken pieces, as well as riprap or smaller rocks. This is riprap. It's kind of a rough stone sloped area. A turtle might struggle here, maybe a lot, but at least it has a chance. So you can tell just by looking at it, there is a slope here. Here's an example of a concrete sloped artificial control. Some more riprap that is put in a sloped fashion. Here's more natural rock, but it's still sloped artificial erosion control. Those rocks didn't end up there on their own. Even in small amounts, it counts. You may see situations like this where rock has been added and, plants or grass have started to grow kind of in the crevices between them, but they're still quite obviously there. And it also counts even if there is an unmowed vegetation belt behind it or on top of it. You would still count it when you're doing your assessment of how much of your 1,000-foot section has sloped artificial erosion control. Couple of interesting examples that we photographed through the years. Is this one sloped or vertical? At the foot of the slope where it reaches the water, it is sloped. There are vertical rock walls that create terraces upland. Again, you can apply the turtle test. A turtle should be able to make it to dry land, and down here it seems sloped enough on this first level that a turtle could do it. They might not get much further unless maybe they take this walkway, but it is sloped. Is this seawall or is it sloped riprap? I would call this seawall again. Even though you have some rocks that have been placed in front of it, turtles aren't very good at leaping, so I don't think it's going to pass the turtle test. This is vertical. This one, again, seawall or riprap, vertical or sloped. It's potentially sloped because of the riprap. Back in here, the turtle might be able to make it, but again, turtles aren't very good at leaping, so definitely take that into consideration. All right, finally, bioengineering or soft engineering erosion control. And this is where natural materials that will eventually biodegrade are used instead of permanent seawalls or rock to stabilize the shoreline, to give plants that are newly planted a chance to root deeply and hold soil in place. Note that while these areas don't get a positive score, I've gotten some questions about that before. Why don't I get plus points for using this instead of rocks? Because it's still not a natural shoreline. You lose fewer points for doing bioengineering than you do for putting in a steel seawall or rock. Because although erosion is being dealt with, it's being dealt with in a way that eventually, with proper maintenance, will be indistinguishable from a natural shoreline. And the shoreline will be considered recovered at that point. So if you know an area where bioengineering was installed years ago, you know that this kind of process was done many years ago, and now most people can't tell that it ever happened and it looks natural, then that shoreline area can be considered recovered, and I would not include it in the percentage of shoreline with evident bioengineering. Here's a zoomed in photo of a similar project. Core logs are made from coconut or other fibers that will eventually biodegrade. And by that time, these plants should be established and preventing erosion and being a natural shoreline. Sometimes these logs are installed large scale. This is a park where they had gone in and installed core log along a long section of shoreline. Putting in stumps and branch bundles to stop erosion is also bioengineering. It's using materials that will eventually rot away, even though it may take a while. Maybe you remember this picture from the woody debris section. You can also include it in your assessment of the extent of bioengineering erosion control in this section. What about stuff like this? We've got kind of a mishmash of things going on here. But again, you've got artificial erosion control, right? There's concrete blocks and cinder blocks that have put in, maybe some stepping stones and other things that they had around the property to prevent erosion. Again, turtle test, probably sloped artificial. A turtle could probably get up on land here. They also have an unmowed vegetation belt, so you could count that in that section. How about this? Is it sloped? Is it natural? Is it vertical? I would probably say vertical artificial, probably. I'd apply the turtle test. A little cone here that warns the turtles that it's not a safe place to go. Very helpful. All right, that's the end of the photo show, giving you a bunch of examples of things that you might see on your lake. What you might have figured out while watching this is that, you know, when we talked at the beginning of the hour about how long does this all take, one thing that is fast to score is natural areas. If you have areas of your lake that are undeveloped, maybe it's a nature preserve or something like that, or one property owner, their house is way over on one side and they own a whole bunch of frontage, but they have done nothing with it. Those are pretty easy to score. They get really good scores in the natural categories, and there's none for all of the development or erosion control, seawalls, that kind of thing that are put in. Those sections will go faster. So if your lake doesn't have a lot of developed lots on it, you'll probably find that score the shore goes pretty quickly for you. So helpful hints, take useful photos. Photos will definitely help you remember why you scored the shore the way you did. You can upload some photos to our database when you're entering your data. Be aware, though, you can only upload 3 photos per section. We only have so much space on our servers to hold photos. So you can take as many as you want for your own reference, but just give us the top 3 if you want to upload photos. We don't need blurry photos. They won't help us. They won't help you in the future either. It's really important, though, to find a way to keep track of where you took the photos. Often our cameras will actually include information in the photo file about the coordinates of where the photo was taken. But I also find there's a very easy, simple way to make sure you do that, and that is to have a notepad or a dry erase board on the boat with you. And before you start taking pictures of each section, say you're on section number 2, you want to take some photos, write a big number 2 on that paper or dry erase board, take a photo of that number 2, and then start taking your photos of section 2. You can even include the number in the photo if you want to just hold it up while you're taking the picture. How do you submit your data? Of course, as we mentioned this morning, it is incredibly helpful for volunteers to enter their own data into the database. Otherwise, we're swamped in the fall trying to get it all entered from 300 plus lakes that have collected data during the year. So you enter your data into the database, and one important note for Score the Shore. This only affects Score the Shore, but you need to enter all your data, all your sections at once. And don't close your browser until it's done. Because if you do, and then you come back later and log back in, our system will think you're entering data from a totally different survey. It will not match them up, your previously entered stuff with the stuff you enter later. So you could walk away from your computer, just don't close your browser. So, if you're somebody on a lake that takes you more than one day to do all of your score the shore, you want to wait until you're completely done. You can wait until September to do it if you want to, and then sit down on a rainy day and get it entered in one setting. Whether you are able to enter your data or not, be sure to make a copy and send it to us. You can either send copies to us through the mail, or you can email it to us. You can scan them and send us scanned PDFs of your data sheets. Um, and the address on where to send it, either a mailing address or the email address, are right on the data form, so it's easy for you to find. When you send it to us, be sure to include that one cover sheet with the basic information and your overall lake score on it, all your data forms, so every sheet you filled out for every section, a map showing us where those sections are. You can't mail us photos. We have no place to keep printed photos. But if you want those included in the long-term record, you'll need to enter them yourself on our website. All right, that's the end of the slide presentation. So at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions that may have come up that Eric wasn't able to address in the chat.
Thanks, Joe. We don't have any questions right now. If there are any, please, this is a great time to put it in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions. I know it can be a challenge to be like, is that vertical? Is that sloped? Especially with rock.
Yeah, and you're out on the boat and you're a little ways out into the water, so it can be a little challenging to know exactly what you're looking at. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we know this is subjective, and that's okay. Just give your best opinion about what you're observing. That will still be useful. Trust us. And it
For
helps you
sure.
come up with that score. It helps you identify areas where, you may see, oh, we got a lot of points in this part of the data sheet, but we lost a bunch of points here. And that right there tells you, oh, well, to increase our score, we need more of this and less of this, just looking at the data sheet. So the subjective answers are still really helpful.
Agreed. And we do have a couple questions that have come in.
Mhm.
Do we include islands?
Yeah, great question. That's still shoreline, right? So if you have islands in your lake, we definitely encourage you to assess their shorelines as well. And even if they're less than 1,000 feet, like the entire island might be fairly small, I would call that its own section, just because it's kind of unique out there in the lake.
And we have a broader shoreline question, but we have some time, so I think that's perfect. What elements of shoreline rehab require permits?
Now, Eric, that sounds like a question for you as vice chair of the Natural Shoreline Partnership. So I'm going to let you start on that one.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. If you are at what's called so where the water meets the land typically is called the ordinary high water mark. If you're moving earth or doing a bunch of things at that line and into the lake, you would need an EGLE permit. EGLE meaning the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. So that's a state permit. Now, if you're moving a bunch of earth in the upland, so above the ordinary high water mark, above the water line, and you're moving earth, that will require local permits, soil erosion permits, because everybody wants to make sure that best practices are being put in place while doing the restoration work. So for example, it might be a silt fence. Those are those black fences you see around construction sites. Um, the permit is there to make sure that those are installed and that designs are in place so to protect the lake while the restoration is taking place and to make sure it's the right um, project for the location.
Yeah, and I put a link into the chat as well with that permitting information. The state recently updated their shoreline webpage, and it's got a wealth of information, including information on permitting. One other feature I would mention, because we talked about wood in the water, right? And we get questions sometimes about whether you need a permit to put like a stump or a fallen tree in the water. And the answer is if you put it in, then yes. If nature does it, you don't have to get a permit for what nature did. If there was a storm or the wind blows a tree down, if you can, we recommend leaving it there because that's good habitat as long as it's not, dangerous or preventing you from accessing the water.
And then there's another question, but I'll just add one more piece because we're giving just little tidbits. If you want to make sure if you need a state permit or not, you can go onto that website that Joe put in there, and there is a map for your county. There's a person with Eagle who works on permits there, and you can have a conversation with them directly, and they'll give you direct advice, yes or no, you need a permit. Okay, Joe, another question with Score the Shore.
Mhm.
Um, this is a question. Channels counted, are channels counted if there are dwellings, docks, and boats?
That's a good question. And I would say, in general, I advise people not to include channels. And the reason why, if you're talking about the kind of these dredged out, or at some point they were dredged out channels to give people access to the water, um, what I recommend that is that they tend to have a lot of dwellings, a lot of docks, a lot of houses. And what they can do is really drop your overall lake score. If you had a lake that was in pretty good shape shoreline wise, but then there's a big development with lots and lots of channels down at one end, your average score may go down quite a bit. If you're interested and you want to include, and sometimes people who live on the channels are interested, I would suggest doing it, keeping them separate, doing the open water lake as part and scoring that and calculating averages, and then you could repeat the process just doing the channels. And that I think is going to give you a more accurate picture of the overall shoreline health of your lake.
Okay, we have still a couple minutes until our chlorophyll presentation, which is coming up at 2. And here's just a couple minutes to ask Joe any more shoreline questions. And Paul, as Joe is answering any of these questions, Paul Steen, our next presenter, if you want to get your presentation up, feel free to do that.
I think what's really kind of cool about this, well, there's a lot of things cool about it, but two things. One is, unlike most of our monitoring, honestly, where we really emphasize the need to be doing it for multiple years. Like if you're measuring phosphorus in your lake, it's, one measurement doesn't tell you a whole lot. It's really best to have multiple years and multiple seasons so you can see changes in your lake. Score the Shore can be actionable right away, right? The minute you're done doing that, you can share the results and start thinking about how you might use those results for understanding your lake and, opportunities for conservation, protection, restoration, and so forth. And so you don't have to wait for a lab result. You don't have to wait for even, a whole season to go by or even multiple years to go by to really feel like you understand the state of your lake. You can use it right away. And then, even more exciting is when you go back and do it again a few years later, especially if there's been an effort on your lake to improve the health of the shoreline. If property owners are, saying, yeah, I get it. This makes sense. I'm going to do some work on my shoreline. I'm going to stop mowing, right along the shoreline, or, I've got a seawall that's failing, I'm going to work on getting that out of there. Those kinds of changes that'll get picked up by the Score of the Shore score. And so, because this is still fairly new to the CLMP, we only have a few lakes that have had the opportunity to repeat it. And it's really fascinating to compare how things are getting better or maybe getting worse, depending on what's been happening in your lake. So, this is something that can be really valuable immediately and in the long term.
And what's great is we have, as individuals who live, if you live on a lake, you can make these changes and yourself. And slowly they can make, if you make the difference, other folks, other neighbors might say, "Hey, what are you doing? That's pretty cool." And hopefully that leads to um, good things for your lake into the future.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because right at the top, we talked about the Shoreland Stewards program, where you answer a questionnaire about your own property, and you can do that anonymously if you wish. If you score high enough, you can qualify as a shoreland steward and even get a sign that you can put out on your property that kind of points out that you're doing this intentionally, that you're being a good steward of the shoreland because you've adopted and you do, lake-friendly practices. And that's a great conversation starter with neighbors about, hey, what's this sign all about? How'd you get that? How do I get one? Right. So,
Right.
yeah, there's definitely, we love to see natural shorelines being contagious around lakes.